"It's too much, but I accept," she whispered. The cowboy claimed the Apache woman. The sun had just begun to rise over the vast, dusty plains of the American Southwest. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and orange as the first light of day began to touch the earth. The air was still, heavy with the warmth of the coming heat, and the only sounds were the occasional call of a bird and the soft rustle of wind in the dry grass. Kaya, an Apache woman, stood on a hill, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her dark hair, braided tightly against her head, fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. Her face, strong and proud, showed no signs of fear or hesitation. She had lived her entire life in these rugged lands, learning their secrets and rhythms from the elders of her tribe. Kaya was known for her sharp mind and quick reflexes, respected by both her people and others who crossed her path. Her tribe had lived here for generations, but these days, they were facing growing threats from settlers moving westward. Kaya was keenly aware of the tensions in the air. The world outside the tribe was changing rapidly, and those who once roamed the land freely now found themselves fighting to protect their way of life. Today, Kaya was on a mission. She had been sent by her people to track the movements of a lone rider who had been spotted near their land. It was not uncommon for settlers or soldiers to wander through these territories, but this man was different. He seemed to be moving through the desert with no particular direction, as if he was lost, or perhaps running from something. Kaya knew the desert better than anyone. She had been raised on its challenges and had learned to navigate its dangers from an early age. Her eyes could pick out even the smallest tracks in the sand, the faintest signs of movement in the dry brush. Today, however, her senses were on high alert. She felt something was off. She moved silently through the desert, the sand warm beneath her feet and the wind carrying the faint scent of sagebrush. Her heart beat steadily, her thoughts focused on the task at hand. She knew that if the stranger was a threat, she would have to be prepared to act quickly. After several hours of careful tracking, Kaya saw a figure in the distance. A lone rider, just as the scouts had reported. He was mounted on a horse, moving slowly, as if unsure of his next move. Kaya could see that the man was not native to the land. His clothes were different, rough, weathered leather that seemed out of place against the smooth curves of the desert. Kaya stopped, hidden behind a rock outcropping, watching him closely. She knew the importance of remaining unseen. If this man was dangerous, she needed to have the element of surprise on her side. She was trained for moments like this. The man continued on his path, oblivious to Kaya's watchful eyes. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, and he wasn't looking for anything specific. He seemed lost. Kaya's fingers tightened on the grip of her bow, but she didn't release the arrow. Not yet. After a few more moments, the rider halted his horse near a small creek that ran through the land. He dismounted slowly and knelt by the water to take a drink. Kaya watched, her keen eyes narrowing. There was something strange about the way he moved. He wasn't like the other men she had seen before, those who came with a clear purpose, whether to trade or to fight. This man seemed weary. His shoulders were slumped, and his movements were slow, as though he had been riding for days without rest. Kaya shifted slightly, positioning herself so she could get a better view. She wasn't sure what it was about him, but something in her gut told her that he wasn't a simple wanderer. He had a story, and that story might be one worth understanding. She took a deep breath, deciding it was time to approach. It was dangerous to trust anyone out here, but Kaya had learned long ago that people, no matter how different, could sometimes offer something unexpected. Whether that was help, information, or even an ally in a world that often seemed to be divided by fear and hatred. Stepping out from behind the rock, Kaya moved silently toward the man, her footsteps muffled by the soft sand. Her bow was still in hand, but she held it loosely, knowing that she needed to approach with caution. When she was just a few paces away, the man turned sharply. His hand instinctively went to the rifle strapped across his back, but he froze when he saw Kaya standing there, her dark eyes locked on his with a steady, unwavering gaze. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions and the tension of two strangers meeting on uncertain ground. The man studied Kaya, his eyes scanning her appearance, her black hair, the weathered buckskin clothing, the fierce look in her eyes. She was unlike anyone he had ever encountered before. Finally, the man spoke, his voice rough and worn. "I mean no harm," he said, his words coming slowly as if he wasn't sure whether she would believe him. "I'm just passing through. I got lost, I think." He didn't seem like a soldier or a settler who had come to claim the land. He seemed lost in more ways than one. "You are far from home," Kaya said, her voice steady and calm, though her words were sharp. "This is Apache land. You don't belong here." "I'm Jack Dalton." Kaya stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his face. "What brought you here?" she asked, her tone sharp but curious. "Are you running from something, or looking for something?" "But I can't go back." There was more to Jack Dalton than he was letting on, and Kaya knew that in a world like this, they could sometimes find unexpected allies in the most unlikely of places. Without another word, Kaya lowered her bow and turned back toward the desert. Jack, after a moment, followed, knowing that the journey ahead would be one he couldn't take alone. After that first encounter, Kaya and Jack found themselves traveling side by side through the desert. The air had warmed, and the sun now hung high in the sky, beating down on the two travelers as they moved forward. Jack had been quiet at first, not entirely sure of what to make of the woman who had found him out in the wilderness. Kaya, on the other hand, was guarded. She had agreed to let him come with her, but the decision wasn't one she made lightly. In her world, trust was a rare thing, and it was something that had to be earned. As they walked, Kaya observed Jack closely. He was different from the other men she had seen pass through these lands. He wasn't part of the army or the settlers who came to take what wasn't theirs. But his presence still felt like a risk. His clothes were worn and patched from years of travel, and his face was marked by a weariness that came from more than just the harsh conditions of the desert. There was something in his eyes, something that told Kaya he was running from more than just the land or the people around him. He was running from a past he couldn't escape. Jack, for his part, kept his distance. He knew he wasn't welcome here, not truly. Even though Kaya had allowed him to walk beside her, he could feel the weight of her silence. She wasn't just keeping watch over him, she was judging him, trying to figure out whether he was a threat or just another lost soul. The desert stretched out before them, a vast, empty world with no end in sight. The heat of the day was relentless, and the only sounds were the occasional clink of Jack's boots against the dry earth and the soft rustling of Kaya's clothing as she moved ahead. It wasn't long before the silence became uncomfortable. Kaya didn't mind the quiet usually, but with Jack beside her, it felt heavier than normal. "You're not from here," Kaya finally said, her voice breaking the stillness. She didn't look at him, but she didn't need to. She could feel his presence, his unease. Jack hesitated for a moment before answering. "No, I'm from further east," he said slowly. "Born in the hills, but I've been traveling for a long time now. Don't have a home anymore." There was something in his voice, something that made her curious. "Why are you running?" she asked bluntly, as she always did. The question wasn't meant to be cruel, but it was direct. There was no room for hidden meanings in her world. People either told the truth or they didn't survive. Jack slowed his pace slightly, considering his response. "I'm not running from anything specific," he said, his words measured. "I guess I'm just trying to outrun myself. Every time I stop, every time I think I've found some peace, the past catches up with me. It's like I'm stuck in a loop, but I don't know how to get out." She had met many people in her life, some who fought, some who ran, and others who simply existed in silence. Jack, she realized, was one of the few who didn't know which path to choose. He was a man caught between two worlds, neither of which he seemed to belong to. The two of them walked on, each lost in their thoughts. The path ahead seemed endless, and the sun continued its march across the sky, casting long shadows behind them. Kaya led the way, her eyes always scanning the horizon. She was used to being alert, always watching for danger, but now she was aware of something else. She was becoming more aware of Jack's presence, his every movement, his every breath. Despite herself, Kaya found herself thinking about what he had said, trying to outrun himself. She knew the feeling all too well. Hours passed and the landscape began to change. The dry desert turned into rocky hills, with sparse vegetation and a few scattered cactus plants. The temperature was starting to drop as the evening approached and the air grew cooler. Kaya knew they wouldn't be able to keep walking much longer. They needed to find shelter for the night and fast. She led Jack to a small ravine nearby, one that had been carved out by centuries of wind and rain. It was a hidden spot, not easily visible from the outside, but it provided enough shelter for the night. Kaya moved with confidence, setting up a small fire pit and gathering some dry brush to burn. Jack helped, though he was not used to this kind of work. His hands were rough and calloused from years of handling a different kind of life, one of open plains and hard labor. Still, he was quiet and willing, not asking too many questions. As the fire began to crackle and send small sparks into the darkening sky, Kaya sat across from Jack, watching him carefully. The firelight danced across his face, casting shadows that seemed to deepen the lines of worry around his eyes. Kaya studied him, her thoughts turning once again to his past. It wasn't hard to see that he was haunted by something, but it was clear he wasn't ready to talk about it. The silence stretched on, but this time it wasn't as uncomfortable. The crackling of the fire filled the air, and for a brief moment, Kaya allowed herself to relax. She hadn't expected to find comfort in Jack's company, but there was something strangely familiar about him. His presence, though heavy with unspoken burdens, seemed to fill the space around her in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Finally, Jack spoke again, breaking the quiet. "You ever think about what comes after?" he asked, his voice softer now, as if he were speaking to himself more than to her. "After all the fighting, after all the running, what happens next?" Not really. She had learned long ago that the future was something you could only hope for but never truly control. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, both lost in their thoughts. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows on the rocks around them. The desert night had settled in fully now, and the temperature was dropping fast. Kaya was used to the cold nights, but she noticed that Jack seemed uncomfortable. He had no coat, no blanket to keep the chill off. Without thinking, Kaya took off her own cloak and handed it to him. Jack looked at her in surprise, his eyes softening for the first time. "Thanks," he muttered, a little embarrassed. Kaya nodded, though she didn't say anything. She wasn't doing it out of kindness, not exactly. It was more a practical gesture. Survival depended on keeping each other alive. But somewhere deep inside, she found herself feeling a strange sense of connection to this man. She didn't know why, but the walls that she had built around herself for years were starting to crack, and she wasn't sure what that meant. As the night stretched on, the two of them sat by the fire, each wrapped in their own thoughts, the desert night growing colder around them. They didn't speak much more after that, but the air between them had changed. The tension that had once been so sharp seemed to ease, replaced by something different, a quiet understanding. Neither of them had the answers to the questions that haunted them, but for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt quite as alone. The days continued to pass as Kaya and Jack traveled together, and with each mile, the desert seemed to stretch on endlessly. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the dry, hot winds swept across the land, carrying dust and the faint scent of sagebrush. As they moved, the silence between them had become more familiar, less awkward, but still filled with an unspoken tension that neither of them could completely shake. Jack had grown used to the desert, though not in the way Kaya had. While she moved with the grace of someone who knew every stone, every shadow, Jack was still learning. His legs ached, his skin burned from the sun, and he often found himself falling behind. Kaya, however, was always there, waiting patiently for him to catch up. She never offered him help directly, but her presence was a steady reminder that he wasn't alone in this vast, unforgiving world. Despite the harshness of the land, there was a strange comfort in their shared journey. Jack could feel it in the way they moved together, like two pieces of a puzzle that, though mismatched, somehow fit. There was no conversation to distract them, just the rhythm of their footsteps, the whisper of the wind, and the crackle of the fire at night. They were two people who had lived through pain and loss, each with their own burdens, but for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel entirely weighed down by it. One evening, after they had set up camp in a small, sheltered valley, Kaya began to notice something different about Jack. He was quieter than usual, staring into the fire as if it held some secret he was trying to figure out. She watched him for a long time before finally speaking. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice calm but piercing as always. Jack shifted, the firelight flickering on his face. He didn't answer immediately, as if weighing how much of himself he was willing to share. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "I don't know why I'm here. Why I'm still moving. It's like there's this weight inside me that I can't shake. I thought maybe coming here to the desert would make it go away, but it hasn't." She stared into the fire, the orange flames dancing in her eyes, but her mind was on Jack's words. Why am I here? She had heard similar thoughts from others before, men and women who had come to the desert looking for answers. Some had found them, others hadn't. "I know what you mean," Kaya said quietly after a pause. Her voice wasn't filled with pity, just understanding. "Sometimes the desert is the only place that makes sense, but it doesn't always have the answers." Her life had never been easy, and she had learned early on that survival didn't come with explanations. It was just something you did. "I keep going because I have to," Kaya said finally. "There is no other choice. I don't think about what comes next. I think about what I can do right now." He didn't know if he could live like that, just surviving one moment at a time. He had always been running, always searching for something better, but he had never truly stopped to think about what he wanted from life. "Is that how you've always lived?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just surviving." "My people have always been at the mercy of those who want to take what isn't theirs. We learn to survive, or we die." She had a strength in her that Jack had only ever seen in stories of warriors and leaders. And yet, she was right here in front of him, sharing her journey, despite the pain that must have been buried deep inside her. He glanced at her again, wondering what kind of pain she carried. He had shared his own struggles with her, but there was still so much about her that he didn't know. "What about you, Kaya?" Jack asked, his voice soft but sincere. "What's your story? What made you the way you are?" She let out a slow breath, the words coming slowly as if testing the weight of them. "When I was young, my family, my tribe was attacked. Many of us were killed and the survivors had to flee. I was too young to understand it all, but I saw things I can never forget." She paused, her voice barely audible now. "I learned that the world isn't kind to those who don't fight for it. And so I fought. I learned to survive, not just for me, but for those who couldn't anymore." "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I didn't know." Jack sat there, feeling the weight of her words sink into him. He had thought that running away from his past would somehow make it disappear, but Kaya's strength made him realize something important, that sometimes facing the past head-on was the only way forward. The silence between them stretched on again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They both sat in their shared thoughts, the weight of their pasts hanging over them but not completely defining them. It was a rare moment of understanding, a rare bond that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. As the fire began to burn lower, casting long shadows across the rocks, Kaya and Jack sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. The night had become cool, and the desert air carried the scent of the earth and the distant sound of a coyote's call. It was a peaceful night, one that seemed to offer a brief respite from the chaos of the world outside. Jack, still staring into the fire, finally spoke again. "I don't know if I'll ever find peace." but maybe, for the first time, I'm starting to think I don't have to. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The days that followed felt like a blur. The landscape seemed to change constantly, shifting from barren deserts to jagged hills and sparse forests, but always with the same relentless sun hanging above them. Kaya and Jack continued their journey, moving in the direction of the Apache camp where Kaya had planned to reunite with her people. The bond between them had deepened over the past few days. They still didn't speak much, but there was a quiet understanding between them. In the rare moments when Jack's past crept into his thoughts, Kaya didn't ask questions. She simply offered the silent strength of her presence, allowing him the space to process whatever he needed. As they drew closer to the camp, however, there was an unmistakable change in the air. The usual peace of the desert seemed to be under threat. Kaya had always been attuned to the land, sensing shifts in the atmosphere long before they became clear. Now she felt it, a creeping tension like the calm before a storm. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cool desert night began to settle in, Kaya stopped suddenly. Jack, who had been walking a few paces behind, nearly collided with her. He looked up, startled. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, as if instinctively sensing the change in her. Kaya stood still, her dark eyes scanning the distance. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint scent, a smell of smoke. It wasn't the sweet scent of sagebrush or the earth after a rain, but something far more dangerous, something that spoke of fire and destruction. "Something's not right," Kaya muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move quickly." He could feel the tension in her body, the way she had become alert and focused. He followed closely behind as she led the way, her movements quick and efficient. The fire, now visible in the distance, was growing brighter with every passing moment. It was more than just a small flame. It was a full blaze, one that threatened to engulf everything in its path. Kaya pushed herself forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been in situations like this before, encounters with soldiers, settlers, and even rival tribes. But this time, it was different. There was something about the fire that felt personal, like someone had deliberately set it to burn her people's land. As they drew closer to the source of the fire, Kaya's suspicions were confirmed. In the distance, they could see the silhouette of a group of men, settlers, from the looks of their clothing, circling the edge of the blaze, their movements chaotic and frantic. They were clearly trying to control the fire, but their lack of skill made things worse. The flames had spread too far, and now they were threatening the Apache camp. Kaya's face hardened, her jaw tightening. Without a word, she motioned for Jack to follow her, and they began to move toward the edge of the fire. The heat grew more intense with each step, the crackling of the flames louder in their ears. Jack had never seen anything like this before. The fire wasn't just a force of nature, it was being used as a weapon. The settlers weren't trying to put the fire out, they were using it to drive the Apache from their land. Kaya's blood began to boil. This was no accident, this was deliberate. They were attacking her people. "We have to warn the camp," Kaya said, her voice cold and fierce. "If we don't get there in time, they'll be trapped." He had no real understanding of the Apache ways, but he could see the urgency in Kaya's eyes, and he trusted her completely. Together, they pushed forward, dodging the rising heat and the thick smoke that was now choking the air. As they neared the edge of the fire, they saw the men more clearly now. There were 5 of them, rough-looking men with the hard faces of settlers who had spent too many years fighting and surviving on the frontier. They were shouting at each other, trying to control the flames, but it was clear they didn't care about the destruction they were causing. They were after something else. Kaya motioned for Jack to stay low, and the two of them crept along the edge of the fire, keeping to the shadows where the smoke was thickest. They couldn't risk being seen, not yet. The men were too close to the Apache camp for them to make any noise. Kaya could feel her heartbeat quicken as they approached. She had to get to her people before it was too late. They reached a small ridge overlooking the camp. From their vantage point, Kaya could see the small group of Apache warriors gathered in a circle, their heads bowed in quiet conversation. They hadn't noticed the fire yet. Without thinking, Kaya stood up, her voice carrying through the air, sharp and commanding. "Get to the high ground," she shouted. "The fire is coming." Her people were quick, skilled, and accustomed to danger, but the fire had come too quickly. Even with all their strength, they might not be able to outrun it. "We need to buy them time." Kaya turned to Jack, her voice low. "I can't do this alone. Will you fight with me?" "Let's do it." Kaya's arrow flew through the air with deadly accuracy, striking him in the chest. He dropped to the ground with a gasp, his eyes wide in shock. The others turned in alarm, but it was too late. Jack was on them in a flash, his knife flashing through the air as he tackled one of the men to the ground. The two of them rolled in the dirt, struggling for control, but Jack's strength and desperation won out. With one swift motion, he pressed his knife to the man's throat, holding him there until the fight went out of him. Kaya had already dispatched the other two, moving with a grace that Jack could only admire. Her arrows were swift, and her movements were precise. She had no time for hesitation, no time for mercy. These men had come to destroy everything she loved, and she would not let them succeed. The last man, realizing that the battle was lost, tried to run, but Kaya was too quick. She sprinted toward him, her bow still in hand, and with a single shot she took him down. The fire was still raging in the distance, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. Kaya and Jack stood together, panting from the effort, their clothes singed from the flames. The heat was still intense, and the smoke made it hard to breathe, but for the moment the danger had passed. Kaya turned to Jack, her face covered in sweat and soot, but her eyes were filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now, though still filled with the strength that had carried her through so many battles. Jack wiped his brow, still catching his breath. "You didn't need to ask." Kaya could feel the weight of what they had just done, but it wasn't over yet. The fire still threatened to consume everything they had, and there was much more work to be done. But for the first time since they had met, she felt a sense of calm. They had fought together and they had won. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were fighting for something real. Together, they turned back toward the camp, ready to face whatever came next. The morning after the battle was one of quiet aftermath. The fire had been contained, and the smoke was now just a distant memory in the cool, crisp air. Kaya stood at the edge of the camp, her eyes scanning the horizon, the early sunlight casting long shadows over the land. The Apache warriors were busy organizing their camp, tending to the wounded and securing the area. They had fought hard, but now the camp was safe again. The settlers had been driven off, and the land, though scarred by fire, had not been lost. Kaya, however, didn't feel like celebrating. There was no victory song in her heart, no sense of triumph. She had seen too many battles, too many lives lost. She had witnessed what it meant to fight for survival, but that didn't make the bloodshed any easier to bear. As she looked at the remnants of the fire, she felt the weight of the world settle on her shoulders once again. The fight was never truly over. Jack, too, was quiet. He had fought by her side, and though he was a stranger in this land, he had proven himself more than once. But now, as he stood beside Kaya, there was a shared silence between them, one that spoke of understanding, of something more than just a battle fought and won. He approached her, his step slow, and paused beside her, looking out over the camp. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "Are you all right?" he asked. Kaya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, her eyes still fixed on the distant landscape. She had never liked to show weakness, never wanted anyone to see the burden of responsibility she carried. But Jack had become more than just a companion. He had become someone she could trust, someone who had seen her at her best and her worst and still chose to stay. "I will be," Kaya said softly, "but not yet. There's always more to do." But there was something in the way Kaya spoke that made him realize how different she was from the person he used to be. She had a sense of purpose, a determination that never wavered. Even in the face of loss and danger, she stood firm. They stood in silence for a while longer, neither one speaking, both lost in their thoughts. The camp behind them was busy with movement, warriors preparing to leave, women gathering supplies, children playing in the distance. It was a familiar scene, one that Kaya had witnessed countless times before. But today it felt different. Today there was a sense of peace settling over the land, a quiet that hadn't been there before. Finally, Kaya turned to Jack, her face softening just a little. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice steady but sincere. "I don't know if we would have made it through the fire without you. Something worth fighting for. Maybe there's a chance to be something else, something better." He was trying to understand who he was, who he could be, in a world that had never given him the chance to be anything but a survivor. "You've already changed," Kaya said softly. "The man you were before wouldn't have fought alongside us, wouldn't have cared about what happens to my people. You've shown me more than just strength. You've shown me that even someone who's lost can still find their way." Maybe he could find peace, not by running from his past, but by accepting it and moving forward. "I don't know what happens next," Jack said, his voice quiet. "I don't know where I belong, but I know I don't want to go back to the way things were. And right now we're still here, still standing." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It wasn't filled with questions or uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that only comes when two people, despite everything that's happened, finally understand each other. The camp was almost ready to leave. Kaya could feel it in the air, the moment of transition, of change. The tribe was moving on, heading deeper into the desert to find a new place, a new home. They had to keep moving. The settlers and soldiers would never stop coming. But Kaya had a new sense of peace now. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had Jack, and though the road ahead would be difficult, she was ready to face it. "You're not alone anymore," Kaya said quietly, her voice steady and sure. Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. "Hope, neither are you. The world might never be kind, and the struggles they faced would never be easy, but for the first time, she felt like they might be able to face it together." They didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't seem to matter. They had found something worth fighting for, a future that wasn't defined by the past, but by the choices they made in the present. And for the first time, that felt like enough.